The courtroom was tense, the air thick with uncertainty. All eyes turned to the small figure who had stood up unexpectedly. A young girl, no older than 11, her chest rising and falling with nervous energy. Her name was Lily Carter, and her father, Thomas Carter, sat at the defendant's table, his face downcast, a mix of exhaustion and defeat in his eyes. The judge, a stern man with graying hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose, looked at the girl with an expression that was equal parts confusion and skepticism. "Miss Carter," Judge Thompson said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "what are you doing?" Lily's hands trembled as she gripped a small notebook tightly to her chest. She took a deep breath, the sound sharp in the silent room. The prosecutor, an imposing man named Gregory Fields, shot her an incredulous look. He opened his mouth to object, but Judge Thompson waved him off with a flick of his hand. "I have something to say," Lily's voice quivered, but there was a determination in it that made the entire room pause. She stepped forward, her heart pounding as she faced the jury, the judge, and the rest of the courtroom, all eyes trained on her. "My dad didn't do it." The murmurs that followed could have shaken the walls. It wasn't just the statement. It was the sheer audacity of a child interrupting the most important moment of the trial. The prosecutor, Fields, leaned forward, his mouth opening to object, but the judge raised his hand for silence. "Go ahead, Miss Carter," Judge Thompson said, his tone softer now, though there was still a thread of skepticism in it. Lily held her notebook out in front of her, a simple brown thing with pages that were well worn from frequent use. "I can prove my dad didn't rob the bank. I have proof." Her words echoed in the room like a challenge. Everyone was listening now, even the jury members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The prosecutor sneered, but the judge's gaze never left Lily. Lily hesitated for only a second before she opened the notebook and began flipping through the pages. "The night of the robbery," she said, her voice growing more confident with each word. "My dad was with me. We were home together, making a birdhouse for school. I know what you're all thinking. This is just a story, but I can prove it." Her voice was steady now, her eyes locked on her father, who sat motionless, shock and disbelief written all over his face. "No, Lily, you don't need to," he whispered, but she ignored him, her focus fixed on the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. "How can you prove this, young lady?" Lily paused for a moment, taking in the room as if gathering her strength. Then she pulled out a Polaroid photo from her notebook. This photo was taken the night of the robbery, at 9:47 p.m. "The exact time the robbery happened," she said, holding the photo up for everyone to see. It showed her and her father sitting at the kitchen table laughing as he held up an unfinished birdhouse they had been working on together. "This was taken right here, in our house," Lily continued. "My dad couldn't have been at the store robbing it." The room fell silent. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for someone to speak. The prosecutor scoffed and stood up, shaking his head. "This is preposterous," he muttered, crossing his arms. "This could have been taken any time." Lily's chin lifted, her resolve clear. "The timestamp says it was taken exactly when the robbery occurred. I even wrote everything down that night. What we ate for dinner, what we watched on TV, everything. I have it all here." She opened her notebook, her fingers tracing the pages filled with meticulous details of the evening. As she spoke, a ripple of disbelief moved through the courtroom. The defense lawyer, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly stood and raised his hand. "Your Honor, this new evidence changes everything. I request that we adjourn and review the photo immediately," he said. Judge Thompson, after a moment of consideration, nodded. "Court is adjourned for the time being." We will reconvene after reviewing the new evidence." Lily's father, Thomas, looked at her with tears in his eyes as officers escorted him back to holding. "You've done it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've saved me." But even as she felt a rush of relief, Lily couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut. This wasn't over. There were still unanswered questions, and someone, somewhere, had been working hard to keep the truth buried. As the courtroom emptied, Lily scanned the crowd, her eyes narrowing as they landed on a man at the back of the room. He was tall, dressed in a dark hoodie, his face partially hidden. He moved quickly toward the exit, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Lily's heart raced as she watched him disappear through the double doors at the back. She turned to her aunt, Karen, who had been sitting next to her in the courtroom. "Did you see that man?" she asked, her voice urgent. Karen frowned, distracted by the chaos around them. "What man?" "There are a lot of people here, Lily." Lily's eyes remained fixed on the door. "He looked like he was trying to hide. Something about him. I don't know. He seemed scared." Karen sighed, placing a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, you've been through a lot today. Let's go home and get some rest. We'll figure this out later." But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She clutched her notebook tightly as they made their way out of the courthouse. Who was that man? And why did he look so nervous? Lily Carter lived in a small, modest house on the outskirts of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was tucked between rows of other humble homes, all of them adorned with picket fences and overgrown gardens. The faint smell of fresh bread baking from a nearby bakery drifted through the air. But there was something heavier in the atmosphere of Lily's home. A sense of absence, of a life once full and now hollow. It was the kind of house where laughter once echoed, but now silence often reigned. Her mother had died a year ago, leaving Lily and her father, Thomas, to navigate the world on their own. It was a hard adjustment. Lily missed her mother more than anything, and though Thomas did his best to fill the void, the weight of it all was often too much for him. Since her mother passed, Thomas had taken on extra work. By day, he worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop, fixing cars and trucks, earning just enough to cover the bills. By night, he worked as a janitor at a nearby office building. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. He wasn't a man who complained, but his eyes often betrayed the exhaustion he carried from the long hours. The lines on his face deepened over time, and his once proud posture had slumped under the burden of their financial struggles. Despite everything, Thomas never let Lily feel the weight of their hardships. Every weekend, he would make her favorite meal, spaghetti, no matter how tired he was. He would help her with school projects, even when he was too exhausted to keep his eyes open. And whenever she had a question about anything, from math problems to what to wear for school, he was always there, listening patiently and offering his best advice. Lily, in turn, adored her father. He was the only family she had left. She admired his quiet strength and the way he always put her needs first. Even though their lives were far from perfect, she knew her father loved her with all his heart. But lately, things had started to change. The tension in the house was palpable. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, unpaid and forgotten. Lily noticed her father growing more distant, not in the way that parents sometimes get preoccupied with work, but in a way that suggested he was carrying a secret. There were moments when Lily would catch him staring into space, his face drawn and troubled, as if he were lost in thoughts he couldn't share. It all came to a head one cold November evening. Lily was sitting in the living room, working on a school project, when she heard the front door open with a heavy creak. It was late, past 10 o'clock, and her father had just finished his second shift at the office. She could tell by the way he walked into the house that something was wrong. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale, and his hands shook as he closed the door behind him. "Dad?" Lily called out, her voice tentative, as she set her notebook down on the couch. Thomas gave her a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, sweetheart, just tired from work," he said, though his voice lacked the usual warmth. Lily wasn't convinced. She could see the tension in his jaw and the way his fists were clenched. Something had happened, something he wasn't telling her. "Are you sure?" Lily asked, standing up from the couch. "You look different." Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm fine, really," he said, though his words sounded hollow. But Lily wasn't sure. She had seen her father tired before, but this was different. There was a heaviness in his eyes, a nervous energy she couldn't explain. As she watched him walk past her, she noticed a faint bruise on his knuckles, a mark that hadn't been there earlier that day. The bruise was small, but unmistakable. Lily wanted to ask about it, to demand an explanation, but something told her now wasn't the right time. Instead, she stayed silent, watching as her father tried to put on a brave face. That night, as he tucked her into bed, Thomas kissed her forehead gently, his lips trembling just slightly. "I'll always protect you, Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't worry, Dad," she whispered back, though she could feel the weight of the moment settling in her chest. The next morning, everything changed. Lily woke up to the sound of sirens. The shrill wail of police cars filled the air, and her heart skipped a beat. She jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to see what was happening. There, outside their house, were 2 police cars. Officers were dragging her father out in handcuffs, his face pale and full of disbelief. "Dad!" Lily screamed, rushing to the front door. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Stay strong, Lily. I love you," he called out, his voice breaking before he was shoved into the back of the squad car. The neighbors stood in their yards, watching the scene unfold in silence, whispers spreading like wildfire. Lily stood frozen, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. Her father was no criminal. He was a man who worked tirelessly to keep them afloat. He couldn't be guilty of robbing a bank. But the police said he had done just that. The officers had arrested Thomas for a robbery at a local convenience store. They claimed that he had entered the store late at night with a crowbar, stolen $1,200 from the cash register, and escaped into the night. A witness had identified him as the robber based on his build and height, and even the police had found hidden cash under their floorboards. Lily's heart sank. Her father insisted he was innocent, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. The police thought they had their man, and Lily had no idea how to prove otherwise. She was taken to stay with her Aunt Rebecca, her mother's older sister, who lived on the other side of town. Aunt Rebecca was kind, but she had her hands full with 3 young children of her own. It was clear that Lily wasn't the only one who felt like a stranger in this new life. But Lily refused to believe the accusations. She spent the next few weeks asking questions, watching security footage, and even sneaking into the local library to learn more about criminal trials and the legal process. And then one day, while going through old photos in the garage, she found something that would change everything. A Polaroid photo, a snapshot of her and her father working on the birdhouse project, with the date stamped clearly at 9:47 p.m., the exact time the robbery had occurred. With this piece of evidence, Lily knew she could prove her father's innocence. But now, her real fight had only just begun. The weeks following Thomas Carter's arrest were a blur for Lily. After being sent to live with her Aunt Rebecca, she felt like a stranger in a place that should have felt like family. Her cousins, though kind, were preoccupied with their own lives, and Aunt Rebecca, while sympathetic, was overwhelmed with the daily chaos of raising 3 young children. Lily spent most of her days in her aunt's spare room, poring over her notebook, trying to find anything that could clear her father's name. She felt a gnawing sense of urgency every day, like time was slipping away and every second mattered. Her father had been denied bail and was being held in a small, cold cell, waiting for his trial. His defense lawyer was kind, but he seemed overwhelmed by the case. Lily couldn't sit back and let her father go to jail for something he didn't do. She needed answers. One afternoon, when Aunt Rebecca had taken her cousins out for a walk, Lily snuck into the living room and sat down at the coffee table, where she had laid out all the documents she'd gathered. Her notebook, filled with pages of notes, was open in front of her. She had spoken to every neighbor she could think of, trying to get more information. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary on the night of the robbery, and none of the security footage had been clear enough to identify the culprit. But there had to be something she was missing. Lily wasn't giving up. Not now. Not when she knew in her heart that her father was innocent. As the days passed, she began to piece together the timeline of events more carefully. The robbery had occurred late at night, but she remembered something. The police had said that Thomas was caught on the store's security camera leaving the scene, but the footage was blurry. Could it have been someone else? Someone who looked like her dad? And why had the police found cash under their floorboards? It didn't make sense. Her father would never have hidden stolen money in their house. One day, while going through a stack of old papers in the garage, Lily found an old Polaroid camera that had belonged to her mother. She smiled softly as she held the camera in her hands. Her mother had taken so many pictures with it, capturing family memories. Lily knew that she hadn't used it in a long time, but something made her want to try. She found some film for the camera and decided to take a few photos of the birdhouse she and her father had built together. It was the same birdhouse from the night of the robbery. She wanted something tangible to hold on to, something that would remind her of the happy times they'd shared before everything went wrong. But as she clicked the shutter and waited for the picture to develop, a thought struck her like lightning. The night of the robbery. Her dad had come home late that evening after working at the office. He had been exhausted but insisted on finishing the birdhouse they had started together for her school project. It was a small moment, a tiny detail in the grand scheme of things, but it was something Lily knew she could prove. She'd taken a picture of her dad that night while they were working. Lily's hands shook slightly as she fumbled for the photo. She grabbed the Polaroid and saw the timestamp. 9:47 p.m. The exact time of the robbery. Her heart raced as the realization hit her. The photo wasn't just a snapshot of a father and daughter working on a project. It was evidence. It was proof that her father couldn't have been at the scene of the crime. Lily quickly grabbed her notebook and scribbled down everything she could remember about that evening. What they ate for dinner, what they talked about, what was on TV. She hadn't thought about it in months, but now everything was coming back to her in vivid detail. She had to go to the courthouse. She had to tell them. This was it. This was the piece of evidence that could clear her father's name. That afternoon, Lily found herself standing outside the courthouse, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands gripped the Polaroid and her notebook so tightly that her fingers ached. She had been to court before, but this time felt different. She wasn't just watching the proceedings, she was going to make her voice heard. Inside the courtroom, the tension was even thicker than before. The jury was present, as was the prosecutor, Gregory Fields, who was busy preparing his case. Lily could feel her stomach twist into knots as she walked toward the front of the room where her father's lawyer sat, looking tired and defeated. "Excuse me," Lily said quietly, catching the attention of the lawyer, who looked up at her with surprise. "You're Miss Carter, right?" he asked. Lily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I have something. I have proof that my dad didn't do it." The lawyer blinked in confusion, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean, proof?" Lily held up the Polaroid and opened her notebook, showing him the timestamp, the notes, and the details. The lawyer stared at the materials for a moment, his eyes widening as he realized the significance. This is important," he said, his voice suddenly urgent. "We need to show this to the judge. Now." Before Lily could respond, the door to the courtroom swung open, and the judge, Judge Thompson, entered the room, followed by the prosecutor. The tension in the air seemed to grow even more oppressive. "Your Honor," Lily's lawyer began, standing up quickly, "we have new evidence that could potentially exonerate my client. We request an immediate review of this evidence." The prosecutor, Gregory Fields, immediately stood up. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've already presented all the evidence. And now this child—" Lily's lawyer held up his hand to silence Fields. "This evidence is crucial. It could change everything." Judge Thompson, looking both surprised and intrigued, gestured for the courtroom to settle. "Proceed," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lily stepped forward, her heart racing, as she held up the photo and explained the situation. She told them about that night, about how she and her father had spent hours working together on the birdhouse. She detailed everything they had done that evening, and as she spoke, the courtroom grew quiet. "This photo proves my dad was home with me," Lily said, her voice steady despite the fear and uncertainty swirling inside her. "He couldn't have been at the store. The timestamp shows it." The prosecutor, though clearly frustrated, couldn't dismiss the evidence entirely. "This photo doesn't prove anything," he muttered, but his voice lacked the usual conviction. The defense lawyer stood up again. "Your Honor, I request an immediate adjournment to review this evidence. This could be the key to clearing my client's name." After a long pause, Judge Thompson nodded. "Court is adjourned until further notice. We will reconvene once this new evidence has been reviewed." As the courtroom began to empty, Lily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had found the truth. But even as she looked around, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the end. There were still too many questions, and too many people who didn't want the truth to come out. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Lily Carter sat at the back, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the front of the room. It had been several days since she had presented the crucial evidence to the court, the Polaroid photo and her meticulous notes. The judge had adjourned the trial to review the new evidence, and now they were waiting for the decision. Her heart raced with uncertainty. Had it been enough? Would they truly believe her? She couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at her gut. Her father, Thomas, sat beside his lawyer, his face a mixture of hope and fear. He hadn't said much since the new evidence was presented, but Lily could see the spark of something in his eyes that had been missing for weeks. Hope. The prosecutor, Gregory Fields, stood at his table, talking to his team in hushed voices, his expression one of frustration. He had tried to dismiss Lily's evidence, but now it was clear that the court couldn't ignore it. The defense lawyer, David Turner, appeared more hopeful than he had in days, his shoulders slightly more relaxed. And then the door opened, and the judge walked in. The room fell silent as Judge Thompson took his seat, his gavel raised. Lily held her breath, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. This was it. "Court is reconvened," Judge Thompson said, his voice firm and commanding. "I have reviewed the new evidence presented by the defense, and after careful consideration, I have decided to allow it into the record." Lily's heart leaped, but there was still a long way to go. The prosecutor immediately stood up, his face twisted in disbelief. "Your Honor, I request that we re-examine the evidence. This is a child's claim. It is insufficient to overturn the charges against the defendant." Lily's stomach sank. Would they reject her evidence again? Judge Thompson held up his hand for silence. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Fields. However, the evidence presented is valid. The court will continue its deliberation. We will proceed with the trial based on the new information." The prosecutor gritted his teeth but said nothing more. He returned to his seat, and the judge called for a short break. Lily exhaled sharply, her nerves still on edge. She had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like they were getting closer to the truth. Lily and her father were escorted back to the holding area where he was kept while the court recessed. As they walked down the hallway, Lily kept her eyes trained on the floor. She could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong. It was too quiet. And then she saw him. The man from the courtroom. The one in the hooded sweatshirt. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, just outside a side door, his head down, trying to avoid being seen. Lily's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The same man she had seen sneaking out of the courtroom days before. He looked out of place, his movements jerky, like he was trying not to draw attention to himself. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. What was he doing here? Was he connected to the case? Was he involved in framing her father? Lily's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, she started moving toward him, her footsteps quick but cautious. She had to know who he was. "Dad, stay close," Lily said, looking over her shoulder at Thomas, who was following behind. He looked confused, but nodded. The man's eyes flicked up as Lily got closer. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He stiffened, his body tensing as if he were ready to run. Before Lily could take another step, he turned abruptly and dashed for the exit. "Wait!" Lily shouted, but he was already gone, disappearing through the back door. She ran after him, her sneakers pounding against the floor. Thomas called her name, but she didn't stop. She had to know who he was. As she reached the door, Lily hesitated for just a second, her hand resting on the handle. She could hear footsteps behind her, heavy, hurried steps. And she knew she wasn't alone. Turning quickly, she saw two men in dark suits coming down the hallway toward her. They were moving fast, their faces cold, eyes locked on her. "Get back," one of them said in a low, menacing voice. "You shouldn't be here." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know who these men were, but she knew they weren't good. They were connected to the case, to her father, to the people who had been trying to silence the truth. Before she could react, the men grabbed her by the arms, pulling her away from the door. One of them shoved her toward a nearby hallway, his grip tightening painfully on her wrist. "What do you want?" Lily demanded, her voice shaking with fear but also defiance. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. The second man sneered, his grip tightening. "You're getting in the way of something bigger than you can understand. Stay out of it, little girl." But Lily didn't back down. She struggled against their hold, trying to break free. In the chaos, her notebook slipped from her hands and landed on the floor. It felt like everything was happening in slow motion. Her father's face, filled with worry, her own racing heart, and the cold, impassive faces of the two men. "Let her go!" Thomas shouted, rushing forward, but the men shoved him back. A loud crash echoed through the hallway as a figure burst in from the side. A man in a hooded sweatshirt, the same man Lily had seen before. He rushed toward the men, swinging something hard at one of them, knocking him off balance. "Run!" the man shouted to Lily, his voice urgent. Lily didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the exit, her feet flying beneath her. Behind her, the sound of footsteps and shouting followed, but she didn't dare look back. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she rounded the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going or how long she could run, but one thing was clear. The danger was real. Whoever those men were, they wanted to stop her from finding the truth. Lily reached the outside of the courthouse, gasping for air. She was about to look around for her father when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, ready to fight, but it was the man in the hoodie. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and anxious. Lily's pulse was racing, but she nodded. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What's going on?" The man glanced over his shoulder nervously, then lowered his voice. "I'm not safe here. Neither are you. Follow me." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked briskly toward an alley. Lily didn't know who this man was, but she had no choice. She followed him, her mind spinning. What was happening? And how was this stranger involved in everything that was going on? Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the man in the hoodie down the narrow alley. The cool evening air seemed to press in around her, the dim light from a flickering street lamp casting long shadows against the graffiti-covered walls. The man didn't speak as they walked, his footsteps quick and purposeful. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, making sure they weren't being followed. Lily's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why had he helped her escape? And why did he seem so familiar, like she had seen him somewhere before? The urgency in his movements suggested that whatever was going on, it was much bigger than she could have ever imagined. She had no idea what she was getting into, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to back down. "Why are you helping me?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper as they turned a corner and disappeared deeper into the alley. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stopped abruptly, turning to face her. The street lamp's glow revealed his face for the first time, and Lily's breath caught in her throat. She had seen this face before, though not in a long time. It was her uncle, Matt Carter. "Uncle Matt," Lily gasped, stepping back in shock. Matt gave a brief, strained smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, kid, it's me." Lily blinked in disbelief. Her uncle had been out of her life for years. He and her father had a falling out long before her mother passed away, and after that, Matt had disappeared from their lives. They hadn't heard from him, not even at her mother's funeral. But now, here he was, standing before her, looking like he hadn't aged a day. "What are you doing here? Why didn't you tell us you were—" Lily's voice faltered. She didn't know how to phrase the questions racing through her mind. Matt sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't have a choice. The people I work for, they're dangerous, Lily. Your dad didn't just stumble onto something. He uncovered something he wasn't supposed to, and now they're trying to make sure the truth stays buried." Lily's head spun. "What do you mean? What truth? And who are these people?" Matt glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching. "I'll explain everything, but we need to get somewhere safe first. I don't know who you can trust right now, but I do know that you're in more danger than you realize." Lily's heart sank. Her mind flashed back to the men in the courtroom, the ones who had grabbed her, the ones who had tried to silence her. She had been right to trust her instincts. This was bigger than a simple robbery. Something much darker was at play, and now it was all coming for her. "Where do we go?" Lily asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to the truth. Matt didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be thinking carefully, weighing his options. "Follow me. We need to get you to a safe house, somewhere they can't find you." Lily nodded, her resolve hardening. She had to protect herself, but more importantly, she had to protect her father. Whatever this conspiracy was, it wasn't just about the robbery. It was about something much bigger, something that had the power to ruin lives. And Lily couldn't let that happen. As they moved quickly through the alley, Matt told her more about what had been happening. "You see, Lily, the guys who framed your dad, they're part of something much bigger. There's a crime syndicate in this town, led by a man named Victor Russo. He runs illegal gambling, smuggling, money laundering, you name it. And your dad, he must have seen something at his second job, something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he overheard a conversation, maybe he stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to, but that's why they framed him. The robbery wasn't about the money. It was a cover-up to get him out of the way." Lily felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. Her mind raced as she tried to process what Matt was saying. Victor Russo, a criminal mastermind with connections everywhere, even in the local law enforcement. It was all starting to make sense, but it was too much for her to wrap her mind around. "Are you saying my dad was framed for something he didn't do? That the robbery was a setup?" Lily asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Exactly," Matt said, his voice low and grim. "They planted the cash in your house to make it look like he was guilty. They wanted to make sure no one would ask questions, no one would dig deeper. But they didn't count on you, Lily." Lily felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper sense of determination. This wasn't just about clearing her father's name anymore. This was about exposing the people who had been hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings, ruining lives, and threatening her family. They turned another corner, and Matt led her to a nondescript van parked in an alleyway, its engine running. "Get in. I'll take you to a safe place." Lily climbed into the van, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't help but wonder what else Matt knew. How far did this conspiracy go? And what were they going to do next? As they drove through the dark streets, Matt turned to her. "You need to understand something, Lily. This isn't just about your dad. These people, Russo's people, they'll stop at nothing to keep their operation running. If we're going to expose them, we need solid evidence. We need something they can't just sweep under the rug." Lily nodded, her mind racing. She had already done everything she could to gather evidence. The photo, the notes, everything she had written down about that night. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. Something bigger. And then it hit her. The flash drive. "You said you've been working on this for months," Lily said, her voice gaining strength. "You must have something. Something that can prove what they're doing." Matt's eyes darkened, and he looked away for a moment, clearly conflicted. "I do," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's not easy to access. The files are encrypted. I've tried to crack them, but without the password, it's useless." Lily's stomach twisted. If they couldn't access the files, how could they bring Russo down? How could they prove everything he was saying? "There's someone who can help," Matt continued, his voice low. "His name is Leo. He's a tech guy I used to know. If anyone can crack the encryption, it's him. But you're not going to like what I'm about to say. It's dangerous. If we go to him, there's a chance we'll lead Russo's people right to us." Lily felt a shiver run down her spine. The risks were mounting, but she didn't have a choice. There was no turning back now. "We have to do it," she said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on Matt. "We have to go to Leo. It's the only way we'll stop them." Matt hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's do it. But you need to be careful, Lily. This is bigger than we thought." Lily sat in the back of the van, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The information Matt had just revealed about Victor Russo and the criminal syndicate he led felt like a heavy weight in her chest. All the pieces were falling into place now, but the realization only deepened her sense of urgency. Her father's innocence wasn't just at stake. There was something much darker at play, and it wasn't going to stop with him. Russo had his hands in everything, and they were running out of time to stop him. The streets of the city blurred past as Matt navigated through side roads and back alleys, avoiding the main highways in case anyone was following them. Lily glanced over at him, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. She could see the tension in his face, the unease that had never really gone away. This wasn't the same uncle she remembered, the one who used to tell her silly stories and play games. This was a man who had been caught in a web of lies and danger, a man who was doing whatever he could to protect his family. They hadn't spoken much since Matt had mentioned Leo, the tech expert who could crack the encrypted files that held the evidence they needed. Lily didn't know Leo personally, but if Matt trusted him, then she had no reason to doubt him. Still, the closer they got to Leo's place, the more her unease grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control, that every step they took brought them closer to a point of no return. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Matt pulled the van into a quiet, dimly lit street on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small row of old brick buildings, most of which looked abandoned. The place looked like a relic from a time long past, forgotten and ignored by the city's pulse. Matt parked the van behind a dumpster, and for a moment they sat in silence. Lily glanced at her uncle. "How do you know Leo will help us? What if he's in with Russo's people?" Matt exhaled slowly, his eyes on the street ahead. "Leo's not in with anyone. He's a tech guy. He doesn't care about the dirty politics or the people behind them. He cares about money. And he owes me a favor. This is my last shot at getting the evidence we need." Lily didn't respond. She wanted to believe Matt, to trust that Leo would be their key to bringing everything to light. But the growing weight of everything was starting to feel like too much. She could feel it in her bones. Things were escalating faster than she could keep up with. Matt's voice broke through her thoughts. "Stay close, Lily, and keep your head down. Leo's place is not exactly on the grid. It's better if we don't attract attention." Lily nodded, though she felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't used to being so cautious. She'd always been the type to face problems head-on. But now, in this world of shadows and hidden dangers, caution was their only ally. They both stepped out of the van, and Lily kept close to Matt as they made their way down a narrow alley that led to a plain door with a faded number on it. No sign, no indication of what was inside. Just an unmarked door that seemed to blend into the rest of the rundown buildings. Matt knocked twice, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed in the silence. The door creaked open almost immediately, revealing a man in his late 30s, dressed in a hoodie and cargo pants. He had dark hair and glasses, and his face was expressionless, as though he was already prepared for whoever showed up. "Matt," the man said, his voice low and gruff. "You look like you've seen better days." Matt gave a tight smile. You don't look so great yourself, Leo, but we need your help. This is Lily. She's, well, she's the reason I'm here. We've got something big, and we need you to crack it." Leo raised an eyebrow, glancing at Lily as if sizing her up. "I'm not in the habit of doing favors without some assurance. What's in it for me?" Lily stepped forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have evidence. The kind of evidence that could bring down a dangerous criminal. But it's encrypted, and we need someone who can break into it. That's you, right?" Leo studied her for a moment longer before shrugging. "Fine. Come on in." They stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind them. The room was cramped and cluttered, filled with old computer parts, monitors, and wires that seemed to have been strewn about haphazardly. In the corner, a large desk was piled with papers and empty coffee cups. It smelled faintly of stale pizza and burnt coffee. "Take a seat," Leo said, motioning to a few mismatched chairs in the corner. "I'll need to see what you've got." Lily handed over the flash drive, her fingers tightening around it as she passed it to him. It was their lifeline, their only hope. Leo plugged the drive into one of his many computers and began typing furiously, his fingers flying over the keys with surprising speed. "You've got the goods on this guy Russo, huh?" Leo muttered under his breath as the computer hummed to life. "I've heard of him. He's not someone you want to mess with." Lily couldn't help but feel the weight of Leo's words. If Leo knew about Russo, then they were playing a dangerous game. But she couldn't afford to back down now. Her father's life was on the line. Matt leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes on the screen. "Just get it done, Leo. We don't have much time." Leo didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the computer screen now, his brow furrowed as he worked. Lily watched him, her mind racing. They were so close to the truth. She could feel it. But there was a nagging sense of unease that wouldn't leave her. She knew it wasn't just the files that had to be cracked. It was the world they were about to enter. A world where trust was scarce and danger was everywhere. As the minutes ticked by, Lily's thoughts wandered back to the courthouse, to the men who had tried to grab her, and to the man in the hood who had been watching her every move. She couldn't stop thinking about him. He was connected to all of this, somehow. And she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching them right now. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Leo looked up from the screen. "It's done." Lily's heart skipped a beat as she walked over to him. "What do you mean, it's done? Is the encryption gone?" Leo smirked. "It's cracked. All the files are open. And let me tell you, kid, there's a lot of dirt in here. You're not going to like what you see." Lily took the flash drive from Leo's hand, her breath catching in her throat. She knew this was the moment they could bring Victor Russo down, the moment they could finally clear her father's name. But as she looked at the screen, she knew their fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The room seemed to grow smaller as the words on the screen filled Lily's mind with dread. The files Leo had cracked contained pages upon pages of incriminating evidence. Bank transactions, secret meeting notes, and surveillance footage. It was all there, a detailed account of Victor Russo's illegal operations, stretching across the city and even reaching into law enforcement and local politics. But it wasn't just about money laundering or illegal gambling rings. There was something far more disturbing hidden in these files. Lily's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she scrolled through the documents, her eyes scanning rapidly for anything that could lead them to the next step. Her heart raced as she absorbed the magnitude of what they had uncovered. It wasn't just about her father being framed. Russo's empire was far more dangerous than she had imagined, and it extended far beyond the walls of the convenience store. Matt paced nervously beside her, his arms crossed tightly as he peered over her shoulder. "What do you see? Is there anything that ties it all together?" Lily shook her head slowly, her breath shaky as she clicked on a file titled Project Clean Sweep. It was a long list of names and locations, many of which were familiar to her. People she knew, businesses in her town that seemed completely normal, but were all tied to Russo's criminal network. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. This wasn't just a few crooked cops or business owners. This was an entire system, a web of corruption woven into every corner of the city. "Lily!" Matt's voice was low and strained, his face pale. "We need to move fast. If Russo finds out we have this—" "I know," Lily cut in, her voice hardening with determination. She had come too far to back down now. But the reality of what they were up against was starting to sink in. As much as she wanted to help her father, the truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a case of clearing his name. It was about taking down an entire criminal network that had its claws in everything. And now, they were in the crosshairs. She scrolled further, her eyes widening as she reached a file labeled Operation Overlord. The file contained surveillance footage from the convenience store the night of the robbery. The timestamp on the footage matched exactly what Lily had said in court. But there was something else in the video that made her blood run cold. A man, tall and thin, wearing a black hoodie, was standing at the back of the store. He wasn't there to rob the place. He was just watching. And then, in the background, Lily saw her father. His face was distorted by the grainy camera, but the timestamp and the angle told her everything. Thomas Carter was at home with her that night, working on the birdhouse. Lily's hands trembled as she zoomed in on the figure in the hoodie. The footage was shaky, but it was unmistakable. The man in the hoodie looked eerily familiar. The same man she had seen in the courthouse. The one who had disappeared so quickly, his face hidden behind the hood. Lily's heart stopped. The man in the hoodie, the one who had been watching her every move, was a part of this. And now, he knew they had the evidence to bring it all down. "Matt," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think I've figured it out. The man in the courtroom. He's one of Russo's people. He's been following me." Matt's face paled, and he stepped back from the screen. "Are you sure?" "We need to be careful, Lily. If he's involved in this, then he knows exactly what we're doing. We can't let him get to us." Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on the man in the video. Her mind was racing. If he was part of Russo's operation, that meant they were being watched, not just by the authorities, but by people who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. The stakes were higher than ever, and Lily knew that if they didn't act fast, they wouldn't be the ones in control anymore. "We need to find out where he's going, what he's planning," Lily said, her voice now filled with a fierce resolve. "We can't let him warn Russo." Matt's jaw tightened. "We don't have much time. We need to get this evidence to someone who can help us. We need to go to the police. The real ones." Lily's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time she had considered going to the authorities, but after everything she had seen in the files, she knew that the police were as deeply involved in Russo's network as anyone else. She couldn't trust them. Not yet. Not when she didn't know who was on their side and who was working for Russo. "There's someone we can trust," Matt said, as if reading her mind. "Agent Reyes. She's been investigating Russo for years, but she hasn't had the evidence to take him down. This could be the break she's been waiting for." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of Agent Reyes, a woman who had been working undercover, trying to bring down Russo's empire from the inside. If they could get the evidence to her, they might actually have a chance of stopping him. But there was a problem. They had to get to Reyes without anyone finding out. If Russo's people were already watching them, then they were running out of time. "I'm going to call her," Matt said, pulling out his phone. "We'll meet her somewhere safe, but we can't waste any more time." Lily nodded, her mind still racing. As Matt made the call, she looked back at the screen, at the evidence they had uncovered, and felt a cold sense of determination settle over her. This wasn't just about her father anymore. This was about stopping a criminal empire that had taken root in her city, an empire that had been feeding off the shadows for far too long. She turned to Matt, her voice steady. "We're going to stop them. We're going to bring them all down." Matt smiled, but it was a grim expression, one filled with the weight of what they were about to do. "We'll need to be smart, Lily. They'll come after us, and if they find out we have this—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what it meant. The sound of Matt's phone buzzing broke the silence. He glanced at the screen, then looked up at Lily. "Agent Reyes is waiting for us. We have to go now." Lily's chest tightened with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She couldn't afford to hesitate. They had the evidence. They had the chance. But now, everything depended on getting to Reyes before it was too late. Lily's heart raced as she followed Matt through the back streets of the city, the van's engine roaring to life as they sped toward the rendezvous point with Agent Reyes. The files they had uncovered were their ticket to taking down Victor Russo, but the danger had never felt more real. Every shadow, every figure on the street felt like a threat. They were being hunted, and the walls were closing in. The weight of what was at stake pressed heavily on Lily's chest. She had always known her father's innocence, but now everything had changed. They weren't just fighting to clear his name. They were fighting to dismantle a criminal empire that had infiltrated every corner of the city, a network that would stop at nothing to protect itself. And she, Lily Carter, was right in the center of it all. Matt glanced over at her as they turned down another side street, the headlights of the van cutting through the darkness. "We need to get to Reyes and get out of here fast. If Russo's people are tracking us, they're not going to let this slide." Lily nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the seat. She knew Matt was right. They couldn't afford to be caught. The evidence they had could bring down Russo's empire, but only if they could get it to the right people before Russo's men found them. As they approached the rendezvous point, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Lily's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a safe place. It was their last hope. Agent Reyes had arranged to meet them here, a place where they could go over the evidence and plan their next move. But even as they pulled into the darkened parking lot, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Stay close," Matt muttered as he turned off the van's engine. "If this goes south, we need to be ready." Lily pushed open the door of the van, her feet hitting the pavement with a dull thud. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city. The buildings around them were run down, the area abandoned, just like the warehouse. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, but the silence made Lily uneasy. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if every pair of eyes in the city were trained on her. "Let's go," Matt said, his voice low, as they moved toward the entrance of the warehouse. They had barely reached the door when it creaked open. Agent Reyes stepped into the dim light, her face hard but relieved to see them. She was dressed in dark tactical gear, her expression businesslike. But as she caught sight of Lily and Matt, she gave a small nod, acknowledging their arrival. "You made it," she said curtly, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one was watching them. "We don't have much time." Lily felt a pang of anxiety but forced herself to stay calm. She handed over the flash drive, her fingers brushing against Reyes's as she passed it to her. The drive was their only hope, the key to exposing everything Russo had hidden. Reyes quickly plugged the drive into a laptop, her eyes scanning the screen as the files appeared one by one. Lily watched, her breath catching in her throat as Reyes scrolled through the evidence. There it was, the detailed records of Russo's operations, the bank transfers, the payments to corrupt officials, and the surveillance footage that connected her father's false arrest to Russo's criminal empire. Reyes's fingers paused over the screen, her eyes narrowing. She muttered something under her breath, but it was drowned out by the sound of footsteps outside the warehouse. Lily stiffened, her gaze snapping to Matt, who had already reached for the gun tucked in his waistband. "Stay down," Matt whispered, his voice calm but tense. Lily's heart raced as she crouched behind a stack of crates. The footsteps outside were getting louder, and from the sounds of it, they weren't alone. Whoever was coming wasn't here to talk. "Who's out there?" Reyes hissed, her voice low and controlled, but the edge of urgency was undeniable. Lily's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route. There had to be one. They couldn't stay here. Not with Russo's men closing in. The sound of the door creaking open sent a jolt of fear through Lily's chest. She turned to Matt, her heart pounding in her ears. "What do we do?" "We run," Matt said, his voice low but firm. "Follow me." Just as he said that, the door crashed open, and 3 men in dark suits stormed into the warehouse. They had guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room. Lily's breath caught in her throat. The men were dressed in the same intimidating, calculated way she had seen before. They were part of Russo's operation. Mercenaries, hired muscle to keep things quiet. Reyes's gun was in her hand in an instant, and she crouched behind cover, motioning for Matt and Lily to do the same. The men fanned out across the room, their eyes sharp, looking for any sign of movement. Lily's stomach twisted in fear, but she kept her breath steady. She had to stay focused. They couldn't get caught now. Not when they were so close to bringing Russo down. Matt motioned for Lily to move, and they crept toward the back of the warehouse, staying low. Reyes covered them, keeping her gun trained on the intruders, ready to act at a moment's notice. Suddenly, one of the men shouted, his voice rough and commanding. "I know you're in here. Come out now, and we won't hurt you." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. They knew they were there. There was no way out, not without a fight. As the men advanced, Reyes made a snap decision. She fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the deafening noise echoing through the warehouse. The men ducked, startled, and that was all they needed. "Now!" Reyes shouted as she sprinted toward the door. "Go!" Lily and Matt followed her, their feet pounding against the concrete floor as they raced toward the back exit. The men weren't far behind, and Lily could hear their footsteps getting closer with each passing second. She glanced over her shoulder, and the first of the attackers was rounding the corner, his gun raised and ready to fire. "Keep running!" Matt shouted, as they burst through the back door and into the alleyway outside. They darted around the corner, into another darkened street, as gunshots rang out behind them. Lily's breath came in ragged gasps as they sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing off the walls. She could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins, urging her to keep going. She wasn't about to let anyone stop them. Not now. Matt grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a nearby fire escape ladder. "Up! Now!" Lily didn't hesitate. She climbed as fast as she could, her muscles burning as she reached the rooftop. Once they were on top, they crouched low, watching the streets below. The men were still searching, but they hadn't seen them yet. "Where do we go from here?" Lily asked, her voice breathless. Reyes looked around, her face hardening with determination. "We're not safe yet. but we'll make sure Russo's empire comes down. We just need to keep moving." Lily nodded, feeling the weight of everything she had uncovered in her bones. They were no longer just fighting for her father's freedom. They were fighting for the truth, and the truth had a way of cutting through even the darkest of shadows. The cold air bit at Lily's skin as she crouched low on the rooftop, trying to steady her breath. Her heart was still pounding from the chase, her body tense from the sudden rush of adrenaline. She could hear the faint sounds of sirens in the distance, but they felt far away, as if the world around them had frozen in place, waiting for the next move. Lily glanced at Matt, who was kneeling beside her, his eyes scanning the street below. He was still on edge, his hands gripping the edge of the rooftop tightly as he peered over. His eyes darted from side to side, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that they were being followed. Lily could sense the tension in him, his nerves stretched thin, but there was a calmness in his demeanor now. He was no longer the uncle she had once known, playful, carefree, and a little reckless. Now, he was a man who had been dragged into a nightmare, and he wasn't backing down. "Do you think they saw us?" Lily asked, her voice low and cautious. Matt shook his head, his expression unreadable. "We're good for now, but we can't stay here long. They'll be looking for us." Reyes, who had been silent beside them, nodded. "Matt's right. We need to move fast. If Russo's people are already searching for us, we're not going to get another chance like this." Lily looked at Reyes, trying to read her expression. The agent's face was set in a grim mask of determination, but there was something else there, something harder, colder. Lily had seen it in the way Reyes had moved, the way she had taken control of the situation without hesitation. This wasn't the first time Reyes had been in danger, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Reyes turned to them both, her eyes narrowing as she formulated a plan. "We need to get to a more secure location, a safe house. But we can't just walk in. If Russo's people are already watching, we'll be walking right into a trap. We need a new route, a new angle." Lily felt a shiver run down her spine. How do we even know we can trust anyone anymore? What if they're already in on it? Reyes gave her a reassuring look, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I trust the people we're meeting. But even then, we need to be cautious. We're not out of the woods yet." Lily took a deep breath, trying to calm the swirl of panic inside her. They had the evidence now. The files on the flash drive were enough to bring Russo down, to expose everything he had hidden for years. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. Every move they made was being watched, and if they weren't careful, it could all come crashing down around them. "We have to move quickly," Matt said, standing up and glancing toward the fire escape. "I know a place, a few blocks away. We'll lay low there for a while." Lily nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't want to waste any time. Her father's trial was coming up, and every second they spent running from Russo's men was a second wasted. They needed to act, and they needed to act fast. The three of them made their way down the fire escape, keeping their heads low, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The streets below were busy, but it wasn't the normal kind of bustle. There was an unease in the air, a tension that seemed to linger like smoke. Lily kept her eyes trained ahead, her hand clutching the flash drive in her pocket. She had the evidence, but that was only part of the battle. The real fight was still ahead of them. They moved through the city quickly, avoiding the main roads and sticking to the quieter, less populated areas. Lily's mind kept drifting back to the man in the hoodie, the one she had seen in the courthouse and the one she had seen in the surveillance footage. He had to be involved in this somehow. But what did he know? Was he a witness? Or was he part of the operation that had framed her father? The question haunted her, but there was no time to dwell on it now. They had to get to the safe house, and once they were there, they could figure out their next move. Matt led them down a narrow street, then turned into an alleyway that led to a small, unmarked door. He knocked twice, and after a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with a rugged face and tired eyes. "Matt," the man said, his voice gruff but welcoming. "You're early. Thought you'd be coming later." "We ran into some trouble," Matt replied, his voice low. "We need to lay low for a while. You have space?" The man nodded and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The room inside was small, dimly lit, and filled with old furniture. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. "Stay here," the man said, locking the door behind them. "I'll make sure no one can find you. You've got maybe a few hours before things get too hot. You should rest while you can." Lily's mind raced as they sat down in the small living room. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had never felt more vulnerable in her life. But as much as she wanted to run, to keep searching for answers, she knew that they had to wait. There was no way they could go after Russo without a plan. Matt sat down across from her, his eyes still scanning the room, as if he were expecting someone to break in at any moment. Lily could see the exhaustion in his face, the toll this whole ordeal had taken on him. But there was something else there, too. A fierce determination. A fire that hadn't burned out. "Lily," Matt said, his voice quiet but serious. "We're getting close. But it's not just about getting the truth out. This goes beyond your father. We have to be prepared for what happens when we bring this all to light. Russo won't go down without a fight." Lily looked at her uncle, her thoughts swirling with everything they had uncovered. She knew he was right. They had the evidence. But exposing it meant risking their lives, and everyone they cared about. "We have to do this," she said, her voice steady. "We can't stop now." Lily sat on the worn couch in the small, dimly lit safe house, her mind racing with everything that had transpired. The tension in her chest wouldn't ease. She could hear the muffled sound of sirens in the distance, but they felt far removed from the real danger that was closing in on them. The evidence they had uncovered, the connections they had traced, and the men who had been chasing them, it all came down to this moment. Matt paced back and forth in the cramped space, his hands clenching and unclenching. Reyes sat beside Lily, her expression unreadable. The weight of their mission hung heavily in the air. "We've got the files," Reyes said, breaking the silence. "Now, we need to make sure they get to the right hands. We need to get this to the FBI, and fast." Lily nodded, her mind focused. She had been through so much already. She couldn't stop now. "But how do we do that without getting caught?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're already on their radar." Reyes met her gaze. "We have one shot at this. I'm making arrangements to meet with someone on the inside, someone who can make sure this evidence gets to the right people. But we'll need to be careful. If Russo's people are watching, it could all come crashing down in seconds." Matt stopped pacing and turned to face them. "We can't wait any longer. We need to act now. If we stay here, they'll find us, and it'll be too late." Lily felt the pressure mounting. Her father's life, her family's future, and the lives of everyone involved in exposing Russo's empire depended on their next move. She took a deep breath. "Let's do it. We can't risk waiting." Reyes stood up, her face hardening. "Stay close. No matter what happens, you follow my lead. We can't afford to make any mistakes." They didn't have much time. The plan was simple but risky. They would get to a secure location, meet with the FBI contact, and hand over the evidence. The rest was up to the agents, but the fear of failure, of being caught, weighed heavily on Lily's mind. As they made their way through the streets, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The tension in the air felt suffocating, like they were being watched from every corner. Every turn felt like a step closer to danger, but they pressed on, moving quickly and quietly through the shadows. They reached the designated meeting point, a quiet, unmarked building on the outskirts of town. Reyes led the way, keeping her gun close but concealed. Matt stayed close behind, and Lily, though terrified, followed their lead. They had to trust that this would work. When they reached the door, Reyes gave a small nod to Matt. "Stay alert. We're in the final stretch." The door opened, and they stepped inside, greeted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A man stepped forward, dressed in plain clothes, but with the demeanor of someone who knew what he was doing. "I'm Agent Reynolds," he said, his voice calm and professional. "You've got the evidence?" Lily handed over the flash drive without hesitation. She had done everything she could. The rest was up to them. Reynolds took the drive, his eyes flicking to the other agents in the room. "We've been waiting for this. You did good." Before they could say another word, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Lily's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Russo's men had found them. Reynolds looked at them urgently. "Get out, now!" In a split second, chaos erupted. Lily's heart raced as they made a break for the back exit. The agents opened fire, creating a distraction, while Lily and Matt pushed through the door. They were so close, but they weren't safe yet. The alley outside was dark, but there was nowhere to hide. Matt grabbed Lily's arm. "Run!" They sprinted down the alley, their footsteps pounding against the pavement as gunshots echoed behind them. Lily's breath came in ragged gasps as they darted through the streets. They couldn't stop now. Not when they had come this far. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound of the pursuit faded. They had lost them. Lily stopped to catch her breath, her legs aching, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. They had done it. The evidence was in the right hands. Russo's empire was about to crumble. And as Lily stood there in the quiet aftermath, she knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to fight. But for the first time in months, she allowed herself a small, quiet moment of relief. Her father was innocent, and the truth had finally come to light.